The doorbell chimed melodiously, and jets of cold air rushed in from the street after the man who'd entered. An unpleasant chill ran down my spine. A short old man walked past me to the counter, smiled, and called the salesman over. It was like a stone fell from my soul. There were no other customers in the small roadside store. A young salesman was bored on a stool behind the counter, lazily leafing through yesterday's newspaper. He paid no attention to me. The old man bought a pack of filterless cigarettes and went away. After waiting for him to go outside, I took the crumpled bills out of my jacket pocket, puzzled the salesman with my shopping list, and put the pre-calculated amount of money on the counter. The guy acted sluggishly, moving around the store with the grace of a sleepy fly, which annoyed me. Time was running out, and I couldn't linger. Besides, it seemed to me, the salesman began to look at me with a sidelong glance. I could detect a nasty interest in his gaze. I had to get out as soon as possible, putting everything I bought into a wide plastic bag with the logo of a well-known grocery chain. I walked quickly out of the store. The street greeted me with an icy wind that threw a fine dusting of snow in my face, covering my eyes with my free hand. I jogged to my car, which was parked nearby. Two pairs of sad and frightened eyes stared back at me. Inside me, everything turned upside down. I climbed into the car and handed the grocery bag to the back seat. Masha nestled the purchases into a neighboring seat without even looking at what was inside. Lisa was staring out the window, showing no interest in the food. I sighed. Look, we need to eat. I'm not in the mood either, but starving won't make me feel any better. Lisa looked at me for a moment, then stared out the window again. The sight of her sad eyes made me want to cry. Masha only shook her head negatively. How tired I am of all this. 3 days. For 3 days, our desperate escape, without purpose or meaning, had been going on, but it had started much earlier. Until 2 months ago, everything was fine. We lived in a private house. I worked as a consultant in a well-known firm, got good money, so that Masha could devote all her time to housekeeping and looking after our daughter Lisa, who had recently been discharged from the hospital after a protracted life went on quite normally, without any special jumps and shocks. At what point did everything change? What did we do wrong? I still haven't found the answer. The first to notice something wrong was Lisa. In her 10 years, she was a very active girl. Not a minute did not sit still, simultaneously engaged in 100 different things. At school, she went to 4 circles at once, from which most of the day spent outside the house. I didn't understand how she managed to keep up with everything, but she didn't seem to be burdened by anything. In other words, then she was the exact opposite of Lisa, who now sat in the car behind me and stared blankly out the window. One day, she told me she saw something strange. From the window in her room, she had more than once noticed a man who seemed interested in our house, standing behind a low fence. She couldn't see his face, but the man frightened her for some reason. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. How many people walk down the street past our house? Dozens of people walk the same route every day. To work, to school, wherever. Frankly, I was skeptical of what my daughter said, but it got worse. One day I saw him with my own eyes. He was standing on the sidewalk, dressed in a plain black jacket and pants, hood over his head, hands in his pockets. I couldn't really see his face, but somehow I was sure he was looking right at me. He stood like that for about half an hour, and when I decided to go outside to see him, he was gone. From then on, I saw the strange guest almost every day. Every time the situation was the same. He stood in the same pose in the same place and immediately disappeared as soon as I opened the front door. Apparently, I thought, he noticed me in the window and managed to hide somewhere among the neighboring houses. Lisa was very frightened by all this, and Masha didn't seem to pay any attention to the creepy type at all. She claimed that she had never seen him and rolled her eyes every time we started talking about him. The stranger continued to make regular appearances at his observation post. I gave up trying to track him down on my own and went to the police. They took my statement, even sent operatives to our house several times, but all to no avail. One day I received a letter from the local police station informing me that nothing strange had been found on my application. 2 or 3 times after work, I hid behind the opposite of our house and waited until dark. But the stranger, as if he had figured out my plans, did not appear at all on those days. One day she told me that she had seen something strange. From the window in her room, she had repeatedly noticed a man who seemed to be looking at our house with interest, standing behind a low fence. She couldn't see his face, but the man frightened her for some reason. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. How many people walk down the street past our house? Dozens of people take the same route every day, to work, to school, wherever. Frankly, I was skeptical of what my daughter said, but it got worse. One day I saw him with my own eyes. He was standing on the sidewalk, dressed in a plain black jacket and pants, hood over his head, hands in his pockets. I couldn't really see his face, but somehow I was sure he was looking right at me. He stood like that for about half an hour. And when I decided to go outside to see him, he was gone. From then on, I saw the strange visitor almost every day. Every time the situation was the same. He stood in the same pose in the same place and immediately disappeared as soon as I opened the front door. Apparently, I thought, he noticed me in the window and managed to hide somewhere among the neighboring houses. Lisa was very frightened by all this, and Masha didn't seem to pay any attention to the creepy type at all. She claimed that she had never seen him and rolled her eyes every time we started talking about him. The stranger continued to make regular appearances at his observation post. I gave up trying to track him down on my own and went to the police. They took my statement, even sent operatives to our house several times, but all to no avail. One day I received a letter from the local police station informing me that nothing strange had been found on my application. 2 or 3 times after work, I hid behind the opposite of our house and waited until dark. But the stranger, as if he had figured out my plans, did not appear at all on those days. One evening, looking out of the living room window, I noticed that something had changed in the pose of the mysterious observer. As I looked more closely, I realized what it was. Now he did not keep his hands in his pockets. They hung loosely along his body. He was clutching something in his right palm, but I couldn't see exactly what it was, and he stood a couple steps closer than usual. I jumped out into the street, but as always, I couldn't see anyone. Needless to say, in those days, I felt terrible, and Lisa was getting gloomier before my eyes, and only my wife remained absolutely calm. Looking at the stranger in the evenings, I noted that every day he came closer and closer to our house, and that frightened me most of all. Now he was no longer appearing on the sidewalk, but standing in our yard, climbing over the fence. I didn't know what to do. After filming him on my phone, I went to the police again, but they didn't even look at the video, just said that they didn't have time for such trifles. I cussed and demanded my superiors, but they wouldn't listen to me anyway. One night, I woke up to a loud scream. It was Lisa. Rushing down the stairs to my daughter's room, I met her halfway. Her face was gone from fear. "Dad," he's standing at my window watching, my daughter said, sobbing, filled with rage. I flew into the room and looked out the window. Yes, he was really there. He was standing in front of our house, centimeters from the glass. His height allowed me to safely see everything that was going on in the room, but even from that distance, I couldn't make out his face. I flicked the light switch, and the wall lamp lit up brightly. There was no one else outside the window. After that incident, the stranger stopped appearing. I still looked outside our house in the evenings, but there was no sign of the creepy visitor. It would seem then that our life should have returned to normal, but it didn't. Since then, I constantly began to catch myself on the idea that at home, in addition to me, Lisa, and Masha, there is someone else. My daughter seemed to feel the same way, though she never once mentioned it. As usual, my wife was the only one who didn't see anything strange. Most often with my side vision, I would notice some movement in the house. It was usually when I was moving from one room to another or turning on the light in the dark kitchen at night. Things in the house began to disappear and then appear in a completely different place. What's more, I began to find items I had never seen before. One day, I found an old homemade knife with a black handle on my desk. It was lying in plain sight, and no one in the house had any idea where it had come from. I threw the knife out the window. The next day, I found it stuck in the front door jamb, but the weirdness didn't end there. All over the house, some symbols began to appear, drawn in charcoal or black crayon. They could be found anywhere. On the bedside table door On the wallpaper behind the TV, on the door jambs, on the floor, under the carpet. There were a lot of them. Unclear triangles with circles inscribed in them, wavy lines, and something that looked like hieroglyphics. I erased them as soon as I found them and never told my family. If they saw them, they didn't tell me. And if they didn't, it was for the best. I didn't want to scare my daughter. I couldn't sleep anymore. I tossed from side to side at night, drenched in sweat. I'd lost a lot of weight in those 2 months and had dark circles under my eyes. 4 days ago, I was coming home from work in the evening as usual. I parked my car, went outside, and almost turned gray in an instant. The same stranger who had been watching us for over a month was opening the door to my house. In his hand, he held a homemade knife with a black handle. I sprinted toward him, but he'd already slipped inside. I threw open the front door and jumped after him, only I didn't see anyone in the hallway. For a second, I was stunned. The sound of footsteps on the stairs leading to the second floor jolted me awake. Jumping over the steps, I fell into our bedroom. Masha and Lisa were peacefully dozing on the bed. The daughter clutched a large book, which together with her mother read in the evening. A stranger in a black hooded jacket stood next to them, his hand raised with a knife to stab them. The rest I remember vaguely. When I regained consciousness, I found myself standing with a bloody knife in my hand. Our observer was lying on the floor, scarlet streams dripping from his jacket. Masha looked at me with unnaturally wide-open eyes. I quickly threw the necessary things into my bag, put my wife and daughter in the car, and drove away from the house without even locking the door. I took one last look around my home. In the window of our bedroom on the second floor, I saw the dark silhouette of a hooded man. He slowly raised his hand and waved at us. And for 3 days, we drove to who knows where, just to get away from that scary place. I thought we could only be safe as long as we were moving. I just hoped that thing couldn't get into the car while we were moving. We could only afford small stops when absolutely necessary. We didn't have the courage to do much more than that. I hadn't slept in 3 nights. It was getting harder and harder to drive because I had no more strength. I could only save myself with strong coffee. The creature kept up with us. I regularly noticed a man with a hood hiding his face running along the road. He moved at the same speed as us, but made no other move. Occasionally, he would disappear from sight. And only then could I briefly stop the car. I realized that it couldn't go on forever. With these thoughts, I drove away from the roadside store. Masha and Lisa sat quietly in the back and were silent the whole way. That saddened me the most. About an hour later, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. I looked closely and couldn't believe my eyes. The whole space of the highway behind us was covered with a thick black haze, which was inexorably approaching us. A whole group of hooded creatures were running along the side of the road parallel to the car. Their heads turned in our direction. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor. The pursuers lagged a little behind at first, but then they were right on top of the car again. Tears welled up in my eyes. "What the hell do you want?" I shouted, slamming my fist into the dashboard. The creatures seemed to hear something. One silhouette separated from the group and rushed toward us. There was a thud, the car shook, and the creature flew away. It was replaced by another one from the roadside. They hit the car with inviolable persistence, and after a while, they returned to the line as if nothing had happened. The black haze behind us grew closer and my hands were shaking. The car was going from side to side. "Oh, it's okay, I'll get you out of here," I mumbled to myself. "It'll be all right." One of the creatures jumped onto the roof of the car, clinging to the edges with its hands. Carefully, she hung her head down and looked right at me through the windshield, and I finally saw her face. Perfectly normal, human features. The only thing that stood out was that the pupils in her eyes were the size of match heads. But that wasn't what scared me the most. I recognized it. It was a face I knew very well because it belonged to me. I didn't have time to think about it. I tried my best to drive straight ahead, in spite of my fatigue and the fact that the head of the fearsome creature was bobbing right in front of my. A black wall of smoke overtook us, licking the rear bumper of the car. But I couldn't go any faster. The creature began pounding on the glass with its fist. Several of its brethren rushed toward the car, trying to grab onto something. My heart was racing. The glass cracked, crumbs spilling into my lap. A hand slid through the hole, grabbing air with its fingers. My eyes went black, and the steering wheel slipped from my hands. The last thing I felt was the impact. I have seen a lot of things in my service, but this story makes me uncomfortable. Major Kopylov rubbed his nose and puffed on his cigarette. The sergeant sitting across from him coughed and began to disperse the smoke with his hand. Kopylov grinned into his mustache, but put out his cigarette. That's what I'm saying, Sergei Sergeyevich. I thought that such things only happen in the movies. Yeah, Kopylov said thoughtfully. For a minute, the policemen were silent, thinking about their own things. However, the thoughts of both, most likely, were occupied with similar things. The electric kettle was gurgling quietly on the table. So what did you say he told you? Broke the silence, Major. He told me about some maniacs. He said he even came to us. I checked. He's not lying. What about us? Nothing the first time. We went out, checked, found no one. The second time we sent him away. Savchenko says he looked very strange then. I thought to detain him for clarification, but I was too lazy. Well, I'll deal with Savchenko later. What kind of laziness he's got? What did the doctor say? He will live. Shrugged his shoulders, Sergeant. He was lucky. He got off with minor injuries. He's lying there now, calling his wife and daughter. What an asshole, huh? He stabbed her at home and took the corpse in his car for 3 days. So wait, what about the daughter? E.A. Kopylov was interested, throwing a tea bag into his mug. The doctors say that it started a long time ago, and he came to us already obsessed or something. His daughter died in the hospital 2 months ago of something chronic. That's probably what made him crazy. The major poured boiling water over the tea and lazily rinsed the bag in it. The sergeant wrinkled his nose at the mere smell of the cheap drink. He's a bastard, of course, said Kopylov, looking into the cup. But, in some ways I pity her. Sergei Sergeyevich, what are you doing? He killed his own wife and did such a mess after that. Why feel sorry for him? Wait a minute, Sergeant. Let me finish my thought. Just think about it. You're living a quiet life. Nothing bad happens in your life. Then the police catch you and accuse you of killing your wife. You see where I'm going with this? You're sitting here now listening to me. But in reality, maybe at this moment, you're in the street stabbing someone with a knife and all this. Kopylov circled his office with his hand. Is just your wild fantasy. Who knows? How can you believe your own eyes after such a thing? It's creepy to me, honest. The sergeant turned pale and looked away. He took a deep breath. In the silence, the ticking of a large wall clock was clearly audible. You shouldn't do that now, Sergei Sergeyevich. I've already seen a lot of things since morning, and even when we were examining his house, and what? Nothing. We're talking about all sorts of devilish things, so I remembered. When we were getting in the car, I looked at the windows of the room where the knife was found, and there was blood all over it, and there was someone standing there, waving his hand. I blinked and it was gone. Now that I've listened to you, I'm wondering, was it a dream?